life started in 1902. The exact date was April 1st. And so the family story is that, in view of the date, that when I was born, I looked up at my parents and said, April Fool. I grew up in Newark, New Jersey, and went to Newark Academy. And from there, I went to Wesleyan. I was going to study engineering, but in my first semester, I came under the influence of a marvelous teacher and a marvelous subject, namely biology. And I just fell in love with the topic. And then and there decided that I didn't want to be an engineer, I wanted to study medicine. My father was a physician, and he didn't want to influence me. And I had the impression that he didn't want me to be a doctor. So we had a wonderful evening. I went home for Christmas vacation, I remember, and he and I were alone one evening. And I, with a little, somewhat timidly, told him that I'd changed my mind and I wanted to study medicine. Well, you can imagine, he was just absolutely delighted. And we put the most wonderfully memorable evenings in my life. A couple of hours after that, as he and I just sat around and talked medicine. I was able to leave Wesleyan in 1922, go to medical school, and then went on and finished at NYU. When I was there, it was the University in Bellevue Hospital Medical School. I lived at home, and it was, as you could guess, a grueling travel back and forth every day. Trolley car down to the railroad station, a train to Hoboken, a ferry boat across the river, and then another trolley car across to First Avenue. The man that really had the greatest influence on me was John Wyckoff. He kind of took me under his wing when I first came to the school and helped me along in an extraordinary way, especially when it came to apply for internship. If we could get an appointment at Bellevue, that we were very proud of that. And I was successful in being appointed to an NYU division. That time, the house physician, he was the boss of the house staff. Dr. Wyckoff had a rule that the house physician had to make an admission note on every patient on the first day of admission. And in the winter, it could be awful. My record was 22 admissions in one day. If I'd spent only half an hour seeing the patient and writing a note, there was 11 hours there. And night after night, I'd fall asleep at the desk on the ward writing up these notes. There were only 2 electrocardiographs in the entire city of New York at that time. One was at the Rockefeller Institute. Dr. Alfred Cohn up there had it. And John Wyckoff had the other one down at the medical school. It was about 15, 20 feet long, as I remember, a great long gadget. I would get a patient ready, put the electrodes on the patient, go over to the window, wave a white flag out the window. A technician over at the medical school would then take the electrocardiogram. Wires somehow or other went all the way from a block from the hospital to the medical school. When she finished with her electrocardiogram, she would wave a white flag out of her window, and I'd take the leads off the patient. Dr. Wyckoff called me in his office one day, and he said, "Mac, you've got a plan for your future. Of course, you can stay here as resident if you like, but I think it's time you moved on." I could have hugged him. And he arranged for me to work on rheumatic fever with Homer Swift at the Rockefeller Institute. And I was to be there for just 2 years. And you cannot imagine, Arthur, how important I became. I was advanced in title to associate in medicine at the age 28, I think the youngest title was ever given. I was given, of course, salary increase with it. I could get married and live outside. And on top of that, I would have a sabbatical leave and study in Germany, which I wanted to do. 1932, I came back to join Dr. Wyckoff at the NYU Medical School. Just having come from 4 years studying, working in rheumatic fever at the Rockefeller Institute, he arranged for me to see all the patients with rheumatic fever on the wards in our division in Bellevue Hospital. And almost at once, because the status of rheumatology, what we today call rheumatology and didn't exist in those days, was so awful that there was no interest in it in the medical school and among the faculty. Meanwhile, Dr. Wyckoff had become dean. He was already a professor of medicine. And so he made me assistant dean and assistant in medicine. A year after the start of the unit in 32, Joseph Bunham finished his residency with Dr. Wyckoff. Dr. Wyckoff arranged for him to go to Yale and to spend a couple of years there, I think, working with John Paul on rheumatic fever, the way Dr. Wyckoff had arranged for me to go to the Rockefeller Institute with Homer Swift. And Joe came back, and I immediately recruited him. So now there were 2 full-time members of the Department of Medicine, and I just can't say too emphatically the role that Joe Bunham played. He was just a wonderful addition to the group. I was busy in the dean's office, of course, as assistant dean, and dividing my time between that and I had a little research laboratory in which I was trying to do some things. And Bunham was just a tremendous influence on what was happening within what we call the rheumatic diseases group. The Cornell Medical School had moving uptown to their new building now at the New York Hospital up on York Avenue. So the building was available. And although NYU couldn't afford it, they couldn't afford not to buy it. And so we took it over. And practically overnight, every basic science department in the medical school doubled its space. Up to that time, there'd been very little opportunity for research. All the space was needed for student laboratories and that sort of thing. So it was every member of the faculty, the basic science faculties especially, just took a deep breath and galloped off in all directions. It was really a stimulating, exciting time. We were a mediocre medical school at the time I went there as a student. It was still not really strong in 1932. By 1957, in the evaluation of the American Medical Association's Committee on Education in Hospitals, we were listed in the top 10. Dr. Wyckoff's contribution to this couldn't be overestimated. And really, it's the reason I became dean. Usually when a dean dies or retires, the powers that be are looking for somebody to come in from the outside and sort of shake things up. The last thing anybody wanted to do was change what Dr. Wyckoff was achieving. And the simple, easiest way to have that program go on was to appoint his assistant. And so that my appointment at the age of 35 to be dean of the medical school was not a tribute to me. I can say this quite honestly. There's no false modesty in this. It was a tribute to John Wyckoff and what was, they wanted that to go on the way it was. One of the programs within the Rheumatic Diseases Study Group was electives that we offered for students who would like to see patients with us on the wards or to work in one of the research laboratories. And it wasn't a terribly big program, but it was, I think it was useful. And it's interesting to me to note that among the people we met in that way were Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin, both of whom were students at the medical school. Along about 1935 and after, as we were approaching the 100th anniversary of the founding of the medical school, there was naturally a lot of thought among the faculty and in the trustees of the university to start a fundraising campaign to build a new medical center. It was clear by the time we needed to have a hospital that belonged to the university. Our clinical teachers who were teaching in Bellevue Hospital would have to go all over the city to see their private patients in other hospitals. We had Bellevue, but they didn't admit the patients that these are physicians, volunteer physicians, most of them serving with no salary or just a pittance. So this was a need, and the medical college building was getting pretty old too. The two buildings, Cornell and the old NYU one, obviously ought to be one building. Unfortunately, about 3 weeks before the date of our dinner, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. People in the medical school were all very much involved in the war effort. In World War I, under the aegis of Dr. Stewart, the great surgeon, when the war broke out, he had started the idea of having hospitals, Army hospitals, staffed by medical school groups. And the first, what was known as Base Hospital Number 1, was started by the people working at Bellevue Hospital, nurses, orderlies, and the medical staff. Now in World War II, so we must do the same thing again. And these hospitals were now called general hospitals. And so Bellevue Hospital again had the distinction of being the first general hospital for service in World War II. As dean of the medical school, I had been placed on the essential list by the university, which meant that I couldn't be drafted or I couldn't volunteer. And this, as the years passed, and these friends of mine were all off being trained and getting this great Army hospital ready, I began to become more and more disturbed and restless about after all, I was in that, I wasn't much older than they were, only a few years, and I really just had to join them. And finally, the unit down there asked the university if they'd let me join. So I went into the Army at that time as executive officer of the first general hospital. At the end of the war, when I came back to the medical school, I was greatly impressed by what had been happening there in the planning way while the war was in progress. Donald Sheehan and Howard Taylor, those two especially, had been the leaders in constant planning of that new medical center that we were going to have to raise money for, that had been the planning that had been ended when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. All that planning went on intensively, all during the war years, and out of it came an excellent treatise on what a medical school should be all about, which indeed was named The Mission of a Medical School, and was written by Dr. Sheehan and Taylor. Aside from encouraging Howard Russ to join us, I think my other contributions were I persuaded Winthrop Rockefeller to become chairman of the fundraising campaign, and I persuaded Mr. Rockefeller to make a generous contribution to the campaign funds. But I think that's about the rest of what happened in the building up the medical school belongs to other people, not to me. Dr. Alwaka arranged for us to have small laboratories for research. Bill Goldring and his renal studies, he had a really world-class laboratory to go to because he worked closely with Homer Smith, unquestionably the leading figure in renal physiology. Keith Cannon, Donald Sheehan, Howard Taylor, Colin MacLeod, and Severo Ochoa, who obtained the Nobel Prize in chemistry. I just mentioned those few, there are many others. 1953, they had created their great clinical center down in Bethesda in the middle of the various research institutes for clinical studies. And at that time, Russell Wilder, who was the director of the institute, invited me to take over the direction of the arthritis program in the new institute. Well, it was a very inviting challenge to take on, but I couldn't do it. I did want to leave the medical school as dean and also have our own rheumatic diseases unit going. So I said I couldn't, but I recommended Joe Bunham. Joe left in 1953 to become director of the Arthritis Program at the National Institutes of Health. And it's historical. I mean, he influenced knowledge and work, research, interest in rheumatic diseases worldwide. When I retired from New York University in 1970, it was with the thought of going to settle down at our home that we owned in South Harpswell, Maine. It had been just a summer home up to that time, and I'd gone there for the first time when I was 3 months old in 1902, so our roots went very deep there. At all events, my plan was to just sail my boat, which was a hobby I loved, and raise flowers. But when I got there, I discovered that there were only 3 rheumatologists in the whole state of Maine, and I learned that you don't retire when it's like that. And so before I knew it, we begun to enter the practice of medicine when I was 68 years old. Finally, when I got to be 86, I decided it was time to stop, and we did. But we missed it. It was great. It was great fun.
Paul and I have come to a place this week on the garden where you can find more breeds of irises than just about anywhere else. This is amazing.
I like to say I'm not really a gardener. I'm a hybridizer. I love the things I've got, of course, but the ones I'm truly interested in are the ones that don't exist yet. We had a few flowers, but nothing in the way of a garden. But the postman left at our house one day an iris catalog, and it wasn't for me. I gave it back to the postman the next day. He said, "I know, doctor, but there is no such address, and it's a MAC name, so I left it here." And that catalog sat on our table for a few weeks. And some dismal January day, I picked it up and started to look at it. It was full of pretty beautiful pictures of flowers. And the first thing I knew, I sent in an order. Now, there was no more sense in the start of my program, hybridizing program, than that. So that's really what started my interest in it. Since then, I've written a book on Siberian irises and one on Japanese, and I have a new one on Siberian irises. So it's been a third career of authors, which has been a very interesting and happy experience.
And is there a fourth career possibly that you're contemplating?
I think I'm going to get to slow down a bit, Arthur.
You're too young for that, Currier.